My name is Lily, and I've always appreciated the tranquility of my neighborhood. The houses are spaced far enough apart to ensure privacy, yet there's still a sense of community. However, ever since my middle-aged neighbor moved into the house next door, something has been bothering me. He's a solitary man, reserved, rarely seen during the day. This alone wouldn't be strange, but what caught my attention was his habit of spending hours in the attic, especially at night. I used to think he was just reorganizing things, maybe old family heirlooms or memories. But as time went on, I started noticing how frequently and intensely he would go up to the attic. It was as if that part of the house was his refuge, a place where he spent most of his nights. Even so, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it wasn't my business what he did with his time. The first few weeks after he moved in were relatively quiet. I'd see him sporadically in the yard, but he never seemed interested in talking. Our interaction was limited to distant waves and formal smiles. The house next door was always quiet during the day, but at night something changed. Sometimes, as I tried to sleep, I would hear heavy footsteps and the creaking of the wooden floor coming from the neighbor's attic. These were sounds that, in another context, might be considered normal, but something about them unsettled me. I tried to ignore this feeling for a while. After all, I barely knew the man, and there was no real reason to be concerned. Maybe he simply had unusual nocturnal habits, and that didn't necessarily mean something was wrong. But the idea that he spent so much time in the attic, away from any social interaction, began to bother me more than I wanted to admit. Unintentionally, I found myself watching his house more frequently, waiting for any sign that might help me understand what was going on. As the days passed, my curiosity began to turn into concern. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. My mind conjured up theories, each stranger than the last, but without any proof, it all seemed like silly paranoia. However, a voice inside me kept telling me that I needed to find out what was happening in that attic. Little did I know that this curiosity would lead me down a path of no return. The nights became more unsettling as I focused on the noises coming from the neighbor's attic. They weren't just footsteps or the occasional sound of furniture being moved. There were scraping noises, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor, followed by an oppressive silence that made my heart race. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that perhaps the old house was making natural noises, but the unease persisted. The first time I heard these sounds, I stayed awake in bed, listening to every detail. It was as if the night stretched on, the minutes turning into hours as I tried to figure out what was happening. The sounds weren't constant, they came at irregular intervals, but each time they emerged, they were loud enough to keep me alert. I knew I shouldn't get involved, that what happened in the neighbor's house wasn't my concern, but I couldn't help it. Something inside me was on constant alert. The noises became more frequent, almost a nightly routine. I found myself lying in bed, waiting for them to start, and when they finally did, a chill would run down my spine. I began to mentally note the times they occurred, trying to find a pattern, but there wasn't one. Sometimes they were early in the evening, other times in the middle of the night. The lack of consistency made it all the more disturbing, as if the neighbor was involved in something that shouldn't be predictable. On one particularly quiet night, the noises were louder than ever. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor echoed so loudly that I froze for a moment, holding my breath. My first instinct was to leave the house, maybe even knock on the neighbor's door and ask what was happening. But the fear of discovering the truth stopped me. What if I was right to be concerned? What if, instead of just random noises, it was something more sinister? I decided I couldn't go on like this. I needed to know what was happening, or I would be consumed by anxiety. But confronting the neighbor directly seemed risky. He was a reserved man, and I didn't want him to know that I was paying so much attention to his movements. However, something needed to be done. The curiosity mixed with fear was a dangerous combination, and I knew I was about to cross a line that shouldn't be crossed. As my unease grew, I resolved that the only way to ease my mind was to try to talk to the neighbor. I didn't want to seem intrusive, but I needed to understand what was going on. I chose a moment when I saw him in the yard, tending to some plants. I took a deep breath, trying to appear casual, and walked over to the fence that separated our houses. He had his back to me, and when I approached, he slowly turned around, with that same indifferent smile that always unsettled me. I started the conversation with small talk, mentioning the weather and complimenting his garden. He responded politely but distantly, as if he was just waiting for me to finish so he could get back to what he was doing. Then, I seized a pause in the conversation and asked directly about the attic. I mentioned that I had heard strange noises at night and asked if he was renovating anything up there. I expected him to give me a logical explanation, something that would put my mind at ease. However, his reaction only made me more suspicious. Instead of answering directly, he let out a short, disconcerting laugh. "Oh, nothing you need to worry about, Lily," he said, with a tone that was both playful and unsettling. "Just organizing some old things. You know how it is. An old house always has something that needs fixing." He shrugged as if he were talking about something trivial, but the way he avoided direct eye contact made me uncomfortable. I tried to press on, offering to help him, perhaps as a way to get inside the house and see what was going on. But he quickly changed the subject, asking about my house and making vague comments about the neighborhood. It was clear he didn't want to continue talking about the attic, and the conversation ended abruptly, with him saying goodbye and going back inside. I stood there for a few moments trying to process what had just happened. As I walked back to my own house, the feeling that something was wrong only intensified. The way he laughed, the way he avoided my question, all of it seemed to reinforce the idea that he was hiding something. But what could it be? My mind was full of questions, and I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I found out the truth. The idea of confronting him directly now seemed impossible, so I needed to find another way to uncover what he was doing in the attic. The next morning, still disturbed by the unsettling conversation with my neighbor, I began watching his house more closely. I knew I was being invasive, but curiosity was stronger than any moral discomfort. I started paying attention to all his movements, hoping to find some clue that would reveal what was going on. It was on a sunny afternoon that I saw something that left me even more uneasy. I was in the kitchen putting away the dishes when I noticed the neighbor leaving his house. He was carrying something heavy, wrapped in a dark sheet, making it difficult to identify what it was. The way he was carrying the object, with evident effort, made me think it could be something large and heavy. He looked around, as if to make sure no one was watching him, before quickly heading up to the attic. I froze, watching him through the window, trying to understand what it could be. My heart began to beat faster as I watched him disappear into the house with the object. Something inside me screamed that there was something very wrong with this situation. I tried to think rationally, telling myself it could be anything, a piece of old furniture perhaps. But the way he was carrying it, with such care and secrecy, didn't seem to match something so simple. My mind started coming up with theories, each more disturbing than the last. After seeing him go up to the attic with the object, I waited for a while, trying to listen for any sound coming from there. But his house was silent, as if the very air was holding its breath. The lack of noise made me even more nervous. I couldn't stop imagining what he was hiding up there, and the need to find out the truth became almost unbearable. I decided I couldn't let it go without investigating further. My curiosity was turning into an obsession, and I knew I had to do something about it. I waited until he left again, watching him through the window, and when I finally saw his car drive away, I decided it was time to act. I grabbed my purse and left the house, trying to look as casual as possible. I knew I was about to do something risky, but my mind was already consumed with the need to discover what was happening in that attic. With my heart pounding, I walked over to the neighbor's house, trying to stay calm. I had thought of an excuse to get inside his house, something simple and plausible, asking for a cup of sugar. I knew it was a cliché, but it was enough to give me a quick look around and hopefully get close to the attic door. I rang the doorbell, already knowing he wouldn't be home, but hoping that maybe the door would be unlocked. To my surprise, the handle turned, and the door slowly opened. I stepped inside, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. The interior was silent, with a heavy atmosphere that seemed to sense my presence. The smell of old wood and mold was strong, and the dark, poorly lit environment added to the feeling of oppression. Every step I took made the floor creak slightly, and I had to fight the urge to run away. But I needed to keep going. I needed to find out what was hidden there. The attic door was exactly where I imagined it to be, at the end of a narrow, poorly lit hallway. As I approached, I noticed something I hadn't anticipated. The door was locked with a padlock. My heart sank at the sight of it. I knew I wouldn't be able to get in without a key, and the thought of searching for it terrified me. But the mere fact that the attic was locked with a padlock only heightened my suspicion that something sinister was going on in there. I stood in front of the door for a few seconds, struggling against the growing sense of panic. I knew that if I were caught there, I wouldn't be able to explain what I was doing. But at the same time, the desire to uncover the truth was overwhelming. I crouched down and tried to listen for any sounds coming from behind the door, but everything was silent. The feeling of being so close yet still so far from the truth was frustrating. Before I could decide what to do next, I heard a noise from outside, the sound of a car approaching. My heart raced and adrenaline surged through my body. It was him. The neighbor was coming back, and I was still inside his house. With trembling hands, I ran out the front door, trying not to make any noise, and since he entered through the garage, he didn't see me leaving. I hurried back to my house as fast as I could, without looking back. I knew I had to find out more, but it was now clear that it would be much more difficult than I had imagined. That night, after the failed attempt to explore the neighbor's attic, I lay in bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The house was silent, but my mind was racing, replaying every detail of what had happened earlier. The fear of being discovered kept me on high alert, but something deeper, a sense that something terrible was about to happen, kept me awake. I knew I was in dangerous territory, but the need for answers was stronger than my fear. Around midnight, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard something that made me freeze. It was a distant sound, muffled but unmistakable, a scream. My breath caught as I tried to understand what I was hearing. The sound was coming from the direction of the neighbor's house, and it was impossible to ignore. It was a scream of desperation, full of agony, followed by an oppressive silence. My heart began to pound uncontrollably, and panic began to set in. I got out of bed, feeling a chill run down my spine. The scream had been so real, so visceral, that it couldn't have been a product of my imagination. I walked to the window, hoping to see something, but the neighbor's house was shrouded in darkness. The attic lights were on as usual, but there was no sign of movement. The night seemed frozen, and the silence that followed the scream was almost unbearable. I tried to think rationally, but the only thing my mind could process was fear. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That I heard a scream coming from the neighbor's house? What if it was just my mind playing tricks on me? What if the neighbor was involved in something truly dangerous, and I put myself at risk by reporting him? The questions swirled in my mind, and indecision paralyzed me. Deep down, I knew that even if it was dangerous, I needed to find out the truth. Finally, after minutes that felt like hours, the sound of footsteps coming from the attic broke the silence. They were heavy, dragging footsteps, as if someone was carrying something. My terror intensified, and I knew that whatever was happening in that house wasn't normal. Whatever it was beyond what I could imagine, and the feeling of helplessness consumed me. I needed to act, but I knew that the next attempt would be decisive. Fear was in control now, and I felt I was about to face something much bigger than I could handle. The night after hearing the scream left me in a constant state of alert. I barely slept, and the few times I did, I was tormented by nightmares about the neighbor's attic. When the day finally broke, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. The feeling that something horrible was happening next door wouldn't leave me in peace until I found out what it was. I waited patiently, watching the neighbor's house, until I saw him leave in the middle of the afternoon. I knew this was my chance. With my heart pounding and determination pushing me forward, I went back to the neighbor's house. This time I brought some tools with me that might help me break into the attic. The fear was still present, but the need for answers was stronger. When I entered the house, I felt the same oppressive air as before, but I didn't let it stop me. I walked quickly to the end of the hallway, where the attic door awaited me. The door was still locked, but with the help of the tools I managed to force the padlock until it broke. The feeling of relief was brief because what I found on the other side of the door left me in shock. The attic was steeped in an unsettling dimness, illuminated only by a weak light bulb swinging from the ceiling. In the center of the attic was a mannequin. But it wasn't an ordinary mannequin. It was dressed in women's clothes, and the face was covered by a photo of me. My entire body froze in horror at the sight. Around the mannequin were jewelry, wilted flowers, and boxes of chocolates, as if it were some macabre altar. Everything was arranged carefully, as if each item had special meaning. The idea that the neighbor had been watching me, studying me, and had created this as some sort of sick homage filled me with a terror I had never felt before. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the attic and I couldn't breathe. The initial shock left me paralyzed, but fear quickly took over and made me retreat. I needed to get out of there. I needed to escape before he returned. My mind was in complete chaos, trying to process what I had seen, but I knew I didn't have time. With trembling hands, I turned on my heels and ran for the door, my heart beating so fast that I could barely hear my own thoughts. But just as I reached the door, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The sound of the front door opening. The front door of the house opened with a slow creak, each second stretching into eternity. My whole body went into absolute panic, but my mind knew I had to act quickly. I ran out of the attic, my legs moving before I could even process what I was doing. Every step I took echoed in the silent house, and the fear of being caught by the neighbor pushed me to run even faster. I rushed down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. The sound of the neighbor's footsteps made my heart race even more, and I knew I didn't have much time. I reached the front door, but before I could get out, I heard his voice, calm and terrifyingly serene. "Lily, are you there?" My entire body froze, and for a moment I couldn't move. That tone of voice, so controlled yet loaded with an implicit threat, was more terrifying than any scream. With an almost superhuman effort, I finally managed to open the door and get out of the house. The fresh air of the afternoon hit me like a wave, but the panic was still with me. I started running to my house, but before I got there, I instinctively turned and looked back. The neighbor was standing in the doorway looking directly at me, with a disturbing smile that made my stomach churn. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching as I fled. That smile, that look, was full of a calm menace, as if he knew I couldn't do anything against him. I entered my house and locked the door, my hands trembling so much that I could barely turn the key. What I had seen in the attic kept replaying in my mind, an image I knew I would never be able to erase. I stood in the living room trying to catch my breath, but the fear and horror were overwhelming. I knew I wasn't safe, that he knew I knew, and that there would be no going back to normal after that. My life had changed forever in that moment. In the days that followed, the fear that he might do something consumed me. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I found a strange mannequin in his attic? What if they didn't believe me? What if he had already gotten rid of all the evidence? The doubt and fear kept me in a constant state of alert, unable to rest or feel safe. I knew I had to get out of there. I had to get away from that house, from that man, before something worse happened. His smile continued to haunt me, a constant reminder that I had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. I could never look at my house the same way again, and I knew my only option was to flee, leave everything behind, and start over somewhere else. In the following weeks, I moved to the other side of town, desperately trying to leave that experience behind. So far, I haven't seen the neighbor again, and each day without that disturbing look makes me feel a little safer. But even though I physically escaped, the memories of what I found in that attic continue to haunt me forever. My name is Ethan, and I've always appreciated the tranquility of the neighborhood where I live. The people here are reserved but polite, and everyone respects each other's space. However, I began to notice something strange about my elderly neighbor who lives alone in the house next door. He's an older man, with gray hair and eyes that always seem lost in some distant place. Over the past few months, I've noticed that he frequently talks to himself, gesturing at the air as if conversing with someone invisible. At first, I tried to ignore his behavior, attributing it to loneliness or old age. After all, many elderly people develop eccentric habits, and he had never caused any trouble. However, as time went on, my neighbor's behavior began to bother me more. He would spend long periods in the yard, staring blankly into space, murmuring things I couldn't understand. Sometimes, I'd see him outside, moving his hands as if trying to ward off something only he could see. What started to disturb me more was the fact that he always seemed to be watching my house. I could feel his eyes on me, even when I was inside. On several occasions, when I looked out the window, I saw him standing in his yard, watching me with that fixed and enigmatic gaze. The discomfort this caused grew by the day, and I began to avoid going out when I knew he was around. The idea that he might be watching my every move left me uneasy. Even so, I didn't know how to address the situation. What could I say? I didn't want to come across as paranoid or hostile, but my neighbor's behavior was starting to affect my daily life. I tried to convince myself that he was just a lonely old man, but the truth is, he made me uncomfortable. No matter how much I tried to ignore him, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversations he seemed to have with the air and the way he watched me as if he knew something I didn't. As the days passed, discomfort turned into concern. I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't know how to deal with it. It was like a constant weight on me, a feeling that something bad was about to happen. And that feeling only got worse every time I saw my neighbor, with his empty eyes and strange behavior. Little did I know that this situation would escalate in a way I could never have predicted. Things started to get even more disturbing when, one day, I found a note stuck to my door. The paper was old and yellowed, with shaky handwriting that seemed to belong to another era. "You need to make peace with the spirits," the note read, with no further explanation. I stared at those words for a long time, trying to understand what they meant. My first instinct was to laugh it off, thinking it might be a bad joke. But something about the note's tone made me hesitate. I kept the note, but the message kept echoing in my mind. Every day, my curiosity and discomfort grew. Who could have left it there, and why? It didn't take long before I started to suspect my neighbor. He was the only one who had been acting strangely lately, and the coincidences were too great to ignore. However, the idea that he was involved in something related to spirits seemed absurd. I tried not to give it too much importance, but the unease wouldn't leave me alone. Days later, I found another note, this time even more cryptic. "The dead must be respected," it said. I began to feel a chill every time I found these notes. It was as if someone was trying to warn me about something, but in a way that didn't make sense. I became more vigilant, paying attention to every detail around me, but I couldn't find anything that explained the notes. Everything seemed normal, except for the pieces of paper that kept appearing on my door. With each new note, the discomfort turned into fear. The messages were always short, but filled with a dark meaning I couldn't decipher. "They are watching," read one of the notes, and that phrase particularly disturbed me. Who were they? And why would they be watching me? The idea that someone, or something, was watching me filled me with growing dread. I started looking over my shoulder constantly, hoping to find some evidence of who was behind it. The stress began to affect my daily life. I couldn't concentrate at work and spent sleepless nights thinking about the messages. With each new note, the situation became more unbearable. I knew I needed to do something, but I didn't know where to start. I was trapped in a cycle of fear and uncertainty, and my neighbor's constant presence, with his increasingly strange behavior, only made things worse. I felt that something was very wrong, but I still didn't know how far this would go. After weeks of being tormented by the notes and the constant presence of my neighbor, I decided that I could no longer ignore the situation. I needed to confront him and get some answers. The idea of talking to him made me nervous, but the uncertainty and fear were starting to consume me. One late afternoon, I gathered my courage and went to his house. I knocked on the door hard, my heart pounding in my chest. When he finally opened the door, his empty gaze met mine, and for a moment I was speechless. I took a deep breath and, with a firm voice, asked him directly if he was responsible for the notes. He didn't seem surprised by the question. Instead, an enigmatic smile formed on his face, and he nodded slowly. "They're trying to warn you," he said, his voice raspy and slow. "The spirits. They're angry. You need to make peace with them." His words left me even more disoriented. The idea that he genuinely believed he was in contact with spirits seemed absurd, but there was something in his tone that made me hesitate. I tried to argue, saying that I didn't believe in such things and that he was scaring me with these messages, but he just shook his head as if he were dealing with a stubborn child. "You don't understand," he said, with a disturbing intensity in his eyes. "They are everywhere. They're around you, waiting for you to acknowledge their presence. If you keep ignoring them, things will get worse. They're already very angry." Every word he spoke was laden with a conviction that made me uncomfortable. Fear began to turn into anger. I didn't want to believe anything he was saying, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something very wrong was happening. I tried to make him understand that he was invading my privacy and causing me a lot of discomfort, but he seemed deaf to my arguments. To him, what he was doing was an act of kindness, an attempt to save me from something only he could see. Finally, with nothing else to say, I stepped back and returned to my house, leaving him standing at the door, still muttering about the spirits. The confrontation didn't bring the relief I expected. Instead, it left me more disturbed than ever. Now, not only did I know he was behind the notes, but I also knew he was convinced I was in danger. The idea that he believed so strongly in something so irrational was terrifying, and worse, I had no idea what he might do next. After the confrontation, I hoped my neighbor would become more reserved, maybe even give up his obsession with spirits. However, things took an even stranger turn. He began to appear at totally unexpected times, always with a new warning about these spirits around. Sometimes he would knock on my door early in the morning while I was still having coffee. Other times, he'd show up late at night, just as I was about to sleep, his face marked by seriousness and fear. Each of his appearances was more unsettling than the last. He would talk about invisible presences, about spirits watching me and waiting for me to act. Every time he showed up, I'd feel a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just what he said, but the way he said it, as if he were absolutely certain that something terrible was about to happen. I tried to politely dismiss him, saying I didn't believe in these things and would prefer not to discuss the subject, but he kept insisting. One night, while I was lying in bed, I heard knocking on my window. My heart raced and I quickly got up to see what it was. To my surprise and horror, it was my neighbor outside, with an urgent expression on his face. "They're here, Ethan. I can feel them," he whispered, his face almost pressed against the glass. My first instinct was to yell at him, to tell him to go away, but seeing him there in the darkness left me paralyzed for a few seconds. Finally, I gathered the strength to open the window just enough to firmly tell him he needed to stop, but he didn't seem to hear me. Instead, he continued talking about the spirits, insisting that he was trying to protect me. "They're getting closer, Ethan. You need to listen. They won't stop until you make peace with them." His words were as disturbing as the look in his eyes. I didn't know if I was dealing with a disturbed man or if something more sinister was going on, but either way, the situation was becoming unbearable. After that night, I started avoiding my own home. I no longer wanted to be there alone, knowing he could show up at any moment with another one of his insane warnings. I spent more time away, trying to avoid my neighbor's oppressive presence. But every time I returned, I found something new. A note, a candle, or even strange charms left at my door. It was as if he was determined to keep me aware that, in his eyes, I was in great danger. And to be honest, I started to wonder if he was right. The situation with my neighbor began to escalate in ways I couldn't have predicted. Along with the notes that kept appearing, I started finding strange objects left in front of my house. First, it was a black candle, burned halfway, with a note attached to it that said, "For protection against vengeful spirits." Fear gripped me when I saw that. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that he believed in these things, or the fact that he was increasingly determined to involve me in his madness. Every day, new objects appeared. One day, I found a charm made of small bones and feathers hanging from my doorknob. The note that came with it said, "To ward off the evil around you." The sight of that grotesque charm made me feel sick. The idea that he was leaving these things at my house, sincerely believing that he was helping me, was both disturbing and frightening. Paranoia began to set in, and I started looking at every shadow, expecting to find something that shouldn't be there. The messages in the notes grew darker and more threatening. "They are angry. You must do something before it's too late," read one note, found next to a container of coarse salt that had been poured in front of my door, forming a circle. I didn't know what to do. The situation was spiraling out of control, and the fear that he might be right, that there was indeed something wrong, began to consume me. Paranoia started to erode my sanity, and with each new object I found, I felt like I was being sucked into a nightmare from which I couldn't escape. One of the most disturbing moments was when I found a small wax figure, crudely sculpted, with a pin stuck in its chest. "To deflect the spirit's hatred," read the note that accompanied it. I couldn't contain the growing fear that this provoked in me. I began to wonder if my neighbor was performing some kind of ritual, or if there was any truth to what he was saying. Every day, the idea that something supernatural might be involved became harder to ignore. The dread that something terrible was about to happen became a constant in my life. I didn't know if I was the victim of a disturbed mind, or if there really was something more sinister at play. My neighbor continued to appear, to leave his warnings and objects, while my sanity seemed to slip through my fingers. It was becoming difficult to distinguish what was real from what was the product of my fear. But one thing was certain. I couldn't go on like this for much longer. My neighbor's behavior started to become more threatening. It wasn't just the constant presence and the strange objects he left, but the messages that began to take on a more urgent and ominous tone. One night, while I was trying to distract myself by watching TV, I heard knocking on the door. I was already tired of his untimely visits, but I knew I couldn't ignore him. When I opened the door, there he was, with a disturbing look in his eyes. "You're in great danger," he said without any preamble. "There's a spirit, a very angry spirit that wants revenge, and it's coming after you." Those words made me freeze. No matter how much I tried to rationalize, fear took hold of me. He continued to speak, explaining that the spirit was tied to something from my past, something I had done, and that now it wanted justice. I tried to protest, to say that this was impossible, but his words were so full of conviction that I began to doubt myself. "You need to take action, Ethan," he insisted, stepping closer. "If you don't do something, it's going to get you. It's going to destroy you. I can feel its presence around you. It's getting stronger." My whole body was trembling, and I didn't know if it was from fear or anger. How could he be so certain? And if all of this was just an illusion in his mind? But no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, his words hit me hard. Fear began to turn into paranoia, and the feeling that I was being watched intensified. The nights became unbearable. I could barely sleep, tormented by thoughts that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. My neighbor's words echoed in my mind, and I began to feel like I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Every sound, every shadow, made my heart race, expecting the worst. I started to question my own sanity, wondering if he was right, or if I was falling into the trap of his madness. Finally, I decided that I couldn't continue living like this. I needed answers, I needed security, but at the same time, I felt trapped in a situation from which I couldn't escape. The fear that the spirit he spoke of really existed began to take over me, and the idea that something terrible was about to happen became more and more real. I knew I needed to act, but I didn't know how. And worst of all was the feeling that, no matter what I did, the danger was inevitable. It all culminated in a night I will never forget. After days of not being able to sleep properly, I returned home after a long walk, trying to clear my mind. When I walked into the living room, what I saw made my blood run cold. My neighbor was there, in the middle of my living room, surrounded by lit candles with objects scattered around him. He was muttering words in a language I couldn't identify, while moving his hands in a ritualistic manner. The scene seemed straight out of a nightmare, and for a moment I was paralyzed. Anger and fear took over me. "What are you doing here? Get out of my house!" I shouted, my voice trembling. But he didn't seem to hear me. He continued with his ritual, his eyes fixed on something that seemed to be beyond me, as if he were in a trance. The smell of melted wax and incense filled the air, and I could feel the tension in the room, as if something invisible was about to materialize. Panic began to grow inside me, and the thought that he might be summoning something terrifying crossed my mind. Finally, I found the strength to act. I moved toward him, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the circle of candles. He resisted for a moment, but then turned to me with a look of desperation. "I'm trying to save you, Ethan. They're here. We need to expel them before it's too late." The conviction in his voice was frightening, but I couldn't allow this to continue. I pushed him toward the door, shouting for him to get out of my house. He finally relented, but before he left, he cast one last look at me. "You don't understand, Ethan. I was trying to protect you. Now they're angry and you're on your own." With those words, he left, leaving me in the dark room, surrounded by candles that were still burning. I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Fear and confusion overwhelmed me, and I didn't know what to do. His words kept echoing in my mind, and for the first time, I felt that maybe he was right. Maybe I really was in danger. After he left, I extinguished the candles and threw away all the objects he had brought. But even so, the fear didn't go away. The idea that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike, was overwhelming. I couldn't sleep that night, feeling vulnerable and exposed. Every sound, every shadow made me jump, and the feeling that something was about to happen wouldn't leave me alone. I knew I needed to do something drastic, but what? In the days that followed the ritual, I knew I couldn't continue living there. My neighbor's constant presence, his warnings and rituals, had destroyed any sense of security I had in my own home. I decided that the only solution was to move far away, leave everything behind, and start over in another place. It wasn't an easy decision, but the idea of continuing to live under that constant terror was unbearable. I began packing my things, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. I managed to find a new place on the other side of town, far enough away that I could try to forget everything that had happened. However, even after moving, the fear was still there. Every night, when I closed my eyes, I saw the image of my neighbor, his eyes full of desperation, and heard his words echoing in my mind. "They're still with you." I couldn't shake the feeling that, even far away, the danger was still around me. A few weeks after the move, I received a letter. When I saw the sender, my heart raced. It was from my old neighbor. I opened the letter with trembling hands, and the words I read sent a chill through me. "They're still with you, Ethan. You may have run away, but they will never leave you alone. You're marked, and their revenge is still coming." The words were written in the same shaky handwriting as the notes he used to leave, and the message was clear. The danger wasn't over. The letter shattered any peace I had found. The idea that, even far away, I could still be under some curse or being pursued by vengeful spirits was unbearable. I began to live in a constant state of alert, waiting for the moment when they would appear. Every sound, every shadow filled me with dread. My neighbor had planted a seed of fear in me that seemed impossible to eradicate, and every day that seed grew, taking hold of me. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was with me, something I couldn't see, but that was always present. The letter was a constant reminder that the nightmare wasn't over, and the idea that I was being pursued by something beyond comprehension was driving me to the brink of madness. I tried to move on, but the fear was always there, a shadow that followed me wherever I went. And deep down, I knew I would never be truly free. My name is Megan, and I've always enjoyed the tranquility of my neighborhood. It was a place where people knew each other by name, and routines were predictable. When Steve moved into the house next door, I thought he'd fit right in. In the first few days, he was extremely friendly. We'd occasionally run into each other in the garden, and he always smiled and made kind comments about the weather or the flowers I was planting. He even brought me cookies once, a gesture I found very thoughtful. However, I soon noticed that Steve's behavior was somewhat odd. Some days, he seemed to avoid any contact, walking past me without even a nod. At other times, he seemed nervous or agitated, as if something was deeply bothering him. I tried not to think much of it, assuming he just had good and bad days like anyone else. But the inconsistency began to intrigue me, especially because sometimes he seemed extremely happy to see me, while other times he appeared almost irritated by my presence. One day, while I was watering the plants in the garden, Steve approached with a big smile on his face and handed me a potted plant, saying it was a gift to brighten my day. I was surprised but thanked him graciously. However, later that same afternoon, I ran into him again in the yard, and this time, he barely looked at me. When I tried to start a conversation, he abruptly cut me off, muttering something about being busy and quickly walked away. I was confused by the sudden change in behavior, but didn't know how to address it. From that moment on, I started paying closer attention to Steve's behavior. It was hard to predict how he would react in any interaction. Some days, he was the perfect neighbor, friendly, helpful, always with a kind word. On other days, he seemed irritated and distant, and on a few occasions, even hostile. These drastic changes made me uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to handle the situation without coming across as intrusive or judgmental. As time went on, I began to feel increasingly nervous around Steve. I never knew which version of him I would encounter, and it made me anxious every time I heard his gate open or his footsteps in the yard. I wondered what could be causing these changes, but hesitated to ask directly. Something told me there was more behind Steve's behavior than he was letting on, but I wasn't ready to find out what it was. One afternoon, while I was washing my car in the driveway, Steve suddenly appeared and started helping me without being asked. He was talkative, full of energy, and we chatted about trivial things. I almost convinced myself that maybe I was overreacting, that perhaps he was just going through a tough time. But my sense of calm didn't last long. Later that day, as I walked to the mailbox, he passed by me and, without any apparent reason, gave me a disapproving look, muttering something inaudible before hurrying away. These contradictory episodes began to happen more frequently. Steve alternated between being the friendliest neighbor and someone who seemed annoyed by my mere presence. This made me nervous, and I started avoiding going outside when I knew he was around. However, he always seemed to find a way to show up, either bringing something over or simply passing through my garden to start a conversation. I felt increasingly uncomfortable, like I was walking on eggshells, never knowing what to expect. On one occasion, Steve showed up at my door with a cake he had baked, saying he wanted to share it with me. I thanked him and accepted the cake, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort I felt whenever he was around. However, just a few hours later, while I was in the yard, he approached me again, this time with a scowl. He casually remarked that I was using too much water while watering the plants, something he had never mentioned before. His sudden change in tone caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to respond. The feeling of unease began to grow. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew something was off. Steve seemed like a completely different person every day, and it was making me increasingly anxious. I started thinking it might be better to keep my distance, but that proved harder than I imagined. Steve seemed to be more present, showing up at unexpected times, with different moods that left me confused and on edge. I knew I needed to stay alert, but I had no idea how to handle the situation. One particularly quiet night, the situation with Steve reached a new level of discomfort. I was at home, trying to relax after a stressful day, when I was abruptly pulled from my state of calm by shouting from outside. The sound was so unexpected that, for a moment, I was frozen, trying to comprehend what was happening. I quickly got up and ran to the window, only to see Steve outside, visibly agitated and yelling in my direction. "I know what you're doing," he shouted, his eyes wide and his voice full of accusation. "You're spying on me. You're plotting against me." His words were charged with an intensity I had never seen before. He stood in front of my house, gesturing wildly, as if he was completely convinced that I was responsible for something terrible. My heart raced, and a wave of fear washed over me. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, watching him through the window, trying to understand what could have triggered this outburst of anger. There was no basis for the accusations he was making, but he seemed absolutely certain that I was involved in some sort of conspiracy against him. Panic took hold of me, and I knew that confronting him at that moment would be dangerous. Steve was completely out of control, and what scared me the most was that there had been no prior warning that he might react this way. I decided that the best option was not to react. I remained still, hoping he would calm down and leave. The shouting continued for a few minutes that felt like an eternity until, finally, Steve took a step back, still muttering to himself, and walked away from my house. I watched him until he disappeared into the darkness, my heart still pounding. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the shouting, and I knew that after that night, nothing would be the same. That night, I slept very little. I lay in bed, trying to process what had happened. Steve's words echoed in my mind, and the image of him yelling at my door wouldn't leave my head. I knew something was deeply wrong with him, and the idea that this could happen again filled me with dread. I tried to convince myself that it could have been an isolated incident, but the fear that it could happen again wouldn't leave me alone. The next day, still shaken by the previous night's events, I could barely get out of bed. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, and the idea of running into Steve made me anxious. However, around midday, while I was in the kitchen trying to make something to eat, I heard the doorbell ring. My whole body tensed and a feeling of fear ran down my spine. The last thing I wanted to do was open the door, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. When I opened the door, I was met with Steve, but he was different. Instead of the angry expression from the night before, he was calm, almost apologetic. In his hands, he held a bouquet of flowers, and the smile on his face was almost kind. "Megan, I wanted to apologize for what happened last night," he began, his voice low and filled with remorse. "I was having a really tough day, and, well, I think I let it show in a very wrong way." I remained silent for a few seconds, trying to process the sudden change. Steve seemed genuinely sorry, but the contrast between the aggressive man from the night before and the remorseful man in front of me was disturbing. I accepted the flowers, more out of politeness than anything else, and murmured a thank you. He continued to apologize, saying he was going through a difficult time and that it wouldn't happen again. "I'm really sorry, Megan," he said, with a look that seemed sincere. Even though I accepted his apology, I couldn't ignore the discomfort I felt. The memory of the shouting and accusations was still fresh in my mind, and the idea that everything could just go back to normal seemed impossible to me. Steve kept talking, trying to downplay what had happened, as if it was just a passing episode that meant nothing. But for me, it was impossible to forget what I had seen in his eyes the night before. When he finally said goodbye and returned to his house, I stood in the doorway for a few minutes trying to collect myself. The flowers in my hands felt like a symbol of the internal conflict I was feeling. On one hand, I wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that it had just been a moment of weakness. On the other hand, I knew there was something deeper going on with Steve, something I couldn't fully understand, but that was making me increasingly uneasy. As the days went by, the situation with Steve continued to deteriorate. What started as unpredictable and disturbing behavior turned into something darker. Steve began to show up at my door more frequently, and his visits were no longer friendly. He was always agitated, with a look that alternated between desperation and anger. What worried me the most was that he seemed obsessed with blaming me for everything bad that was happening in his life. On one of these occasions, he showed up at my door early in the morning, with an expression of frustration and anger. "Did you know I got fired?" he asked, not even waiting for an answer. "Of course you knew. I know you're involved in this, Megan. I don't know how, but you are." His words hit me like a punch, and I tried to explain that I had nothing to do with it, but he didn't seem to listen. He was convinced that I was the cause of all his problems, from losing his job to his financial difficulties. With each visit, his accusations became more irrational and desperate. He blamed me for things that made no sense, like an increase in his electric bill or a problem with his car. I tried to stay calm and reason with him, but nothing seemed to work. Steve was becoming more and more out of control, and I felt like I was dealing with a completely different person from the one I had met when he first moved in. The fear that he might do something irrational began to grow inside me. The tension was palpable, and the simple sound of his gate opening made me jump. I knew the situation was getting out of control, but I didn't know what to do. Confronting him seemed dangerous, but ignoring what was happening was impossible. I began to consider the possibility of calling the police, but I feared that might make things worse, making Steve even more aggressive. Each day my anxiety increased. Steve was becoming more and more present in my life in a way that I couldn't control. He was becoming more insistent, showing up at unpredictable times, always with a new accusation, always blaming me for something I couldn't possibly have caused. The fear that he might cross a dangerous line kept me in a constant state of alert. I knew I needed to do something, but I had no idea how to deal with this increasingly threatening situation. Desperate for answers, I started looking for information about Steve. I knew I needed to understand what was happening with him, and the only way to do that was by talking to other people who might know him. I spoke with some neighbors on the street who might have more information about him. That's how I discovered something that completely changed my view of the situation. Steve had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. At first, I was shocked. The idea that he was dealing with a mental illness explained a lot. His mood swings, his outbursts of anger, and even the friendly behavior followed by hostility. However, the most concerning part of the story was that, apparently, Steve had stopped taking his medication some time ago. This meant he was dealing with the symptoms without any kind of treatment, which could be extremely dangerous, both for him and those around him. This discovery made me even more worried. Knowing that Steve was dealing with an untreated mental disorder made me realize that the situation was more serious than I had imagined. I began to wonder if he was aware of what he was doing, if he understood the impact of his behavior on me and others. However, this understanding also brought a new layer of fear. If he wasn't taking his medication, there was no way to predict how he might act next. From that moment on, my fear was mixed with compassion. I knew Steve needed help, but I also knew I wasn't capable of providing that help. I had no experience dealing with situations like this, and the risk of getting involved seemed too high. At the same time, I felt a growing responsibility to do something, to ensure that he received the treatment he needed. However, the reality was that I didn't know how to proceed. Each day, the tension between us increased, and I felt more and more trapped in a situation I had no control over. I began to consider my options. I could try talking to him about what I had discovered, but I feared that might trigger an even more aggressive reaction. I could call the police or mental health services, but I feared that might be seen as a betrayal and make the situation even worse. I was stuck in a dilemma, unable to decide what to do while Steve's behavior continued to deteriorate. The only thing I knew for sure was that I needed to be prepared for anything. The situation with Steve started to escalate in a frightening way. More and more often, he would show up at my door at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, with bloodshot eyes and a face marked by lack of sleep. He seemed to be sinking into his own paranoia, his accusations becoming increasingly incoherent and frightening. What had once been uncomfortable conversations now turned into direct confrontations, with him demanding answers for things I clearly hadn't done. One of those nights around 3 a.m, I was awakened by the sound of insistent knocking on the door. Panic immediately gripped me, and I knew, even before looking, that it was Steve. He was outside, shouting things I could barely understand. "I know what you're doing, Megan. I know you're plotting against me. Open this door now." His voice was full of insane rage, and terror paralyzed me for a few moments. I didn't know what to do, but I knew opening the door wasn't an option. What terrified me the most was the realization that he was completely out of control. His words were incoherent, mixing baseless accusations with desperate pleas for answers. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding wildly as I listened to the relentless banging on the door. Each knock seemed to reverberate inside me, raising my fear to an unbearable level. I knew Steve wasn't going to leave easily this time. I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. The fear that this might trigger something even more dangerous stopped me from acting immediately. As I tried to decide what to do, the knocking grew louder, more desperate. He was clearly in a state of delirium, and the idea that he might manage to force his way into my house filled me with a terror I had never felt before. Every second felt like an eternity, and I knew I needed to act before it was too late. Finally, gathering my courage, I picked up the phone and dialed the police. My hands were trembling so much that I could barely hold the phone. I explained the situation, my voice barely coming out from how terrified I was. They said they would send someone immediately, but I knew it could take a few minutes, and every minute felt like an eternity. Steve continued banging on the door, his words becoming more and more threatening as I huddled in the corner of the room, praying that help would arrive in time. When I heard the police sirens in the distance, I felt a momentary relief, but the panic was still there. The knocking on the door continued, and Steve seemed more determined than ever to get inside. "You can't hide forever, Megan," he shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of rage and despair that made me even more terrified. I remained still, trying to make as little noise as possible, as I listened to the sounds of the approaching police. The sound of the sirens finally seemed to catch Steve's attention, and he stopped banging on the door. For a moment, everything was tense silence, as if the whole world had stopped breathing with me. Then, I heard quick footsteps moving away from the door, and relief began to wash over me. However, the fear was still there, pulsing in my veins, and I knew the situation wasn't over yet. I waited, holding my breath, until I heard voices outside, indicating that the police had arrived. I carefully opened the door, and the sight of the police was like an anchor of safety amid the chaos. They asked me what had happened, and I tried to explain as best I could, still trembling with fear. As I spoke, I noticed that Steve was being detained across the street. He looked completely lost, glancing around as if he didn't understand what was happening. The image of that man, who once seemed so friendly, was now marked by a sadness and confusion that made me realize how serious his situation was. The police managed to restrain Steve and took him to an ambulance that had arrived. He didn't resist, but the look he gave me as he was being taken away left a knot in my stomach. It was no longer a look of anger, but of deep sadness, almost as if he knew he had lost something important. I stood there, watching as they took him away, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. I knew I had done the right thing by calling the police, but the feeling that I could have done something earlier to help still haunted me. After it was all over, I went back inside and locked the door behind me, still trying to process everything that had happened. The peace I felt now was mixed with a sadness I couldn't fully understand. I knew Steve needed help, and the situation could have been much worse if I hadn't acted. However, the thought that he was suffering, dealing with something beyond his control, left a weight on my chest that I couldn't shake. In the days that followed, I tried to get back to my normal life, but the memories of that night continued to haunt me. The idea that Steve was out of control, but still aware enough to understand that something was wrong, wouldn't leave my mind. I moved to another part of town, trying to leave it all behind, but the experience marked me deeply. So far, I haven't seen Steve again, and each day without that disturbing look makes me feel a little safer. But I know that, even as time passes, I'll never be able to forget what happened.